On today's episode of Two Broads Talking Politics, I'm joined by Crystal Littlejohn, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Oregon, and author of the forthcoming book, Just Get on the Pill: The Uneven Burden of Reproductive Politics. Hi, everyone. I am Kelly. This is Two Broads Talking Politics, and I am on today with Dr. Crystal Littlejohn, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Oregon. And we're going to be talking about her book. So first, hello, Crystal.
Hi. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, thank you for joining me. So you have this new book coming out called Just Get on the Pill: The Uneven Burden of Reproductive Politics. So I wanted to start just if you could tell me a little bit about how you got interested in this topic, what inspired you to do this kind of research, and then we can dive a little bit more into sort of what exactly the research is and what it says.
Absolutely. So this all started for me way back in college when I noticed my peers just talking about their experiences trying to prevent pregnancy using different birth control methods. And then when I went to graduate school to study sociology, I just decided to dig around a bit and realized that the literature didn't talk much at all about people's experiences with dissatisfaction. And that is what I heard nothing but people talking about when I was in college. And I decided, I want to just dig some more into this and see what's going on, see what's happening, and try to give voice to people's experiences. And that led to this project that over the course of many years, analyzing all of these interviews, eventually culminated in the book.
Yeah, so then let's talk some about what type of research this is. So I think, people who aren't deeply involved in academics might not really know what sociologists do. And of course, there's different kinds of research done in sociology. So could you talk us through a little bit the methodology for the kind of research you're doing, and sort of what that means?
Absolutely. I would say that social scientists are the sleuths of the social world, right? So what we do is we're trained to think like detectives, to see patterns, and to try and make sense of them. Or we find problems and we go ahead and try and fix those problems. In my case, I noticed a glaring issue in birth control. Women and people who can get pregnant felt frustrated by trying to prevent pregnancy without enough support from their partners. And socially, we just don't take their frustration seriously. And so what I wanted to do was then go ahead and start a project where I could really try to explore that further. And so the hallmark of social science research is being systematic. We collected over 100 interviews for this project. And whether you're using survey methodology, experiments, or interviews, the goal is to make sure you design the study ahead of time, that you have enough data, you ask the right kinds of questions so that you can get people to open up about their experiences and really make sure that you can get into as many different aspects of those experiences as you can. And so for Just Get on the Pill, I was part of a research team that interviewed just over 100 women in the San Francisco Bay Area. We posted flyers to recruit women, and then we held interviews that lasted about 1 to 3 hours where we talked to them about their sexual history. So we asked about each partner they had experienced sexual intercourse with. We talked about their experiences with birth control, side effects, dissatisfaction, and then any pregnancies that they had. And once we had all of those data, all of those interviews done, I then dove in and analyzed the interviews. There were more than 3,500 pages of data. So it took me years to get through that data. But although it was a lot of work, the women's stories are remarkable. And it was so clear that their stories needed to be told in a book.
And you did some controlling, right, to make sure that you had sort of a range of different demographics represented. Can you talk a little bit about what that looked like?
Exactly. So as we were doing the research, we wanted to make sure that we had women who had experienced pregnancies as well as those who hadn't experienced pregnancies. The goal of the larger study was to be able to understand people's experiences using birth control, and especially getting a clearer sense of what happens when they want to prevent pregnancy, but they're not using birth control to do so. And so we have women in the study who represent a range of different racial backgrounds, as you're mentioning. So we have a quarter of the sample that was Black women, white women, Latinx women, some Native American women, as well as Asian women. So it's a, as I mentioned, a very diverse sample. We have people who are from higher income backgrounds, lower income backgrounds. We sampled on community college campuses and four-year university campuses, or say we recruited from community college campuses and four-year university campuses. And so the data represent a really wide swath of young women. The women in the study were between the ages of 20 and 29. So a wide swath of women who had different experiences with being pregnant or not be, or never experiencing pregnancy, as well as a range of experiences with their partners.
And did you have hypotheses going into this, or were there things that really surprised you sort of as you and the team were talking to these women?
Yeah. So for me, I was really interested in women's experiences with side effects. So my earlier research started by looking at dissatisfaction and seeing that even though we're not talking about dissatisfaction as a society, it's actually really important in people's lives. And so I initially started out in my research using surveys, but the surveys couldn't tell us what's going on with people, right? They say that they're stopping because of dissatisfaction with side effects, but what does that look like? What are their experiences? How are they making sense of them? We didn't have very much information on that at all. And so for me going into this project, I was really interested in trying to understand what's happening for women, what is generating dissatisfaction with their methods, what do they do when they start to feel dissatisfied or they believe they're having side effects, how do they make sense of that, and what do they do moving forward? And so that was my interest going into the data. I didn't know much about what it was going to turn out to look like, and that's one of the most fascinating and fun things for me as a social scientist, is that sometimes you think you're going into a project, you think you know what's going to happen, and it turns out completely differently. Sometimes you have your hunches confirmed. For me, this was a topic that was unexplored. And so I imagined that dissatisfaction was going to be important. I just didn't know exactly what that was going to look like. And I will add here that the one thing that was really fun for me was that I didn't actually anticipate that there was going to be so much discussion of women feeling like they had to carry the burden of preventing pregnancy largely by themselves. And so what ended up becoming the focus of my book wasn't even what I imagined I would be writing about going into it. And so it was really fun as I started to peel back the layers to see that this was going to be a book that was important for telling these women's stories, even as I hadn't necessarily anticipated that was going to be the case going into the project.
Did you find as you were talking to women, you said these conversations are 1 to 3 hours. Was there hesitation? Of course, these are people who volunteer for this, but, was there hesitation in talking about a subject that they maybe aren't very used to talking to strangers about? What does that sort of actually look like when you're in the room having those discussions? I
found that women overwhelmingly wanted to talk about their experiences. We didn't get in when the interview started. We were talking to them about their goals for the future. We talked to them about their experiences with their daily lives. So we didn't go right into talking about their experiences with their sexual experiences with their partners. But once we started getting into it, they were actually quite enthusiastic about just sharing their experiences. And I think this stems from a broader challenge that we have in our society for many people, where not many people can just have somebody listen to them for 1 hour to 3 hours and just talk to them about their lives and ask them about what's going on for them and just really listen to their experiences. And I think that was really powerful for women in the study. And many of them actually ended up saying at the end of the interview how much they appreciated just having an opportunity to share their experiences with somebody else, to have somebody listen, to share experiences that they may have never shared with anybody else before, but it felt like a really cathartic experience to be able to share about their sexual histories and sexual experiences with an interviewer and a person, right? At the end of the day, we're people who are talking to other people and listening to other people and trying to understand their lived experiences.
Yeah. So you alluded to this already. And of course, the subtitle of the book alludes to this too, The Uneven Burden. But talk me through what the findings of your research were and what you actually found as you were talking to these women.
Absolutely. I found that our society applies intense social pressure to use birth control only on people who can get pregnant and not on their partners. So rather than telling couples that both people can and should use birth control to prevent pregnancy, our society pushes women largely to do it by themselves using birth control methods that are designed for their bodies. And so Just Get on the Pill tells the story of how women learn to accept that responsibility. One woman, for example, started using the pill after her mom found a condom wrapper and realized that she was having sexual intercourse. And so as I was kind of having this conversation with this woman, I thought, this is awesome. She's having sex. She's using condoms to protect herself from pregnancy and STIs. But what her mom saw was that her daughter wasn't on the pill. And so she told her that they were putting her on birth control. She made the appointment for her daughter. She sat in the appointment with her daughter. As this woman is recounting the story, she literally tells me that her mom says to the doctor, this is what's happening. She needs to be on birth control. This is what I think that she should do to prevent pregnancy, right? And so she was absolutely channeled into using prescription birth control, in her case, the pill, even though she had been using condoms with her partner. And so what ends up happening is she stops using condoms, right? She gets on the pill, she stops using condoms with her boyfriend, and they go on to just rely on her using prescription birth control. And I found this over and over and over in the book, right? That woman after woman told story after story of how they came to be the person responsible for preventing pregnancy. And it wasn't just parents, it was providers who helped them understand that it's their job to prevent pregnancy and channeled them toward doing so with the pill or with the shot or the IUD, whatever their method was. It was friends, it was partners, right? Partners played a huge role in this as well. And so the book is really about how women learn that it's their social job to prevent pregnancy and the negative consequences that can result from that, even though we take it for granted and assume that it works, right? We have these effective methods, people are using them, the pill is liberatory, we assume that it works, but we are missing this really dark underside that is people are being pressured to use birth control methods. And it's not always about their reproductive freedom. And it doesn't always feel liberating for them when they are taking the primary responsibility for preventing pregnancy.
Yeah, and you found a little bit then of a difference racially too in exactly how this plays out and what this means. Can you talk a little bit about what that was?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things in the book is that Black women were also channeled into using prescription birth control methods or encouraged to use prescription birth control methods, but they were much less likely to just go ahead and start using those methods than were women of other races. And so even though all women and all people who can get pregnant face social pressure to try and prevent pregnancy using methods like the pill that are designed for their bodies, I found that Black women were less likely to just kind of go with that flow and say, okay, it's their job to use the pill to prevent pregnancy. Instead, they expected their partners to keep using condoms, even if they did go on the pill, or they just told their partners no, right? They're not just going to get on the pill or the shot. Their partners had to keep using condoms throughout their relationship. And this was, in large part, they expressed just the feeling that it was unfair to expect that women should be responsible for preventing pregnancy all by themselves. But they also talked about the importance of making sure they prevented STIs, right? And really protecting themselves from STIs using condoms. So they saw condoms as their method too, not just the method that was meant for their partners. And that was something that definitely differed by race.
Yeah, and I was interested in the framing. You just started to get at that a little bit, but the framing of sort of condom as a male method of birth control and prescription as a female method of birth control. Can you talk about that framing and sort of why you're looking at it in that direction and how that maybe starts to get us toward thinking in some other way about birth control and birth control options?
Absolutely. I love all of the questions that you're asking. This question in particular was such an exciting surprise for me when I started doing this work. And so what I found is that women very much understood external condoms, as you're mentioning, male condoms, right? They understood that as something that was meant to be for the man. And when we look at our society, we could Google it right now. If you Google male condom, there so many results come up. And the idea is that we teach people that external condoms belong to men, even in the way that we label them. We have the male condom and we have the female condom. And this very much socializes people to believe that there are particular methods made for particular bodies. And in this case, the belief is that male condoms are for men and prescription birth control methods are for women, or the female condom is for women. But obviously the female condom people use a female condom much less often than they use the quote unquote male condom. And so what this looked like in practice was that women believed that their partner should be responsible for providing condoms when condoms would be used. And it was their job to make sure that they were on prescription birth control. And we could imagine that is a fine arrangement as long as everybody kind of does their part. But of course, in practice, that's not what it looked like, right? In practice, you had women that were pressured into using prescription birth control or felt like it was their job to use prescription birth control. And I want to be clear, right? It's not that everybody feels like using prescription birth control was coercive, right? It's not that everybody felt that way, but it's that they were socialized to believe that it was their job to prevent pregnancy using those methods. And that often contributed to them not thinking that it was a big deal that their partners weren't using condoms to help them contribute to the partnership, making sure that a pregnancy didn't happen if that's what they were interested in. And so women just came to accept that they should use prescription birth control methods like the pill, and they really abdicated responsibility for providing condoms, for buying condoms, for using condoms to their partners. And they saw that as something that their partner should have to take care of. And in the data or in the interviews, we saw what that looks like. And I talk about this in Just Get on the Pill, where because of that expectation, partners didn't always bring condoms, obviously. And when they didn't, it oftentimes led to people not using anything. They might just use withdrawal, or they might not use any form of birth control. In multiple cases, actually, there could be a condom provided, but if the partner said he didn't know how to use it, there were a number of cases where the woman didn't know how to use it either. And so they ended up not using anything, even though a condom was available, just because of this lack of knowledge. And so channeling people into these different methods can seem natural in our society, but to me, it's very much just like we've moved away from understanding that things like clothing, right? Like pants, at one point we imagined were for men, right? And we moved away from that and said, no, that's absurd. We shouldn't think about it that way. And that's very much how I think about prescription birth control and the quote unquote male condom, right? We need to move away from this kind of gendered language that teaches people that really important tools for pregnancy and disease prevention only belong to one person or one partner and not the other.
And it's so striking. You started your research thinking about dissatisfaction, and men certainly are very vocal about their dissatisfaction with condoms. And that comes up in the interviews as you're talking to women about what their partners are saying. But any woman who's been on prescription birth control of any kind can certainly tell you that there are side effects. And maybe they're not always terrible, but there are certainly side effects. They exist. So that seemed like another sort of gendered, like it was acceptable for the man to say, well, I'm dissatisfied and the side effects of this mean that I won't do this, but that it wasn't okay for women to express the same. Is that sort of what you were finding in your research?
Yes, that's spot on, right? There's this idea that, as you're just saying, in our society, there's vocal acknowledgement about the fact that men don't like condoms, or some men don't like condoms, but there is this silence about the fact that many women and people who can get pregnant don't like prescription birth control. Some people choose not to use it, but lots of them continue to use it, right? They don't necessarily like it, but they continue to use it. And there is intense social pressure for them to do so, right? When people talk about not liking to take the pill every day, for example, you're much less likely to find people that say, that's understandable, maybe you just aren't going to use it, right? Instead, We have method, set an alarm every day, make sure you do this, right? We find ways to get them to use it, to find it more acceptable. One woman who had, speaking of side effects, one woman who had nausea on the pill talked about how she would just take it every night so that she could sleep through any of the side effects that she was having to it, right? And so there is absolutely this de-emphasis on women's dissatisfaction with prescription birth control, and this expectation that if they don't like it, they just have to put up with it, or they can bounce around and try different methods until they find a method that works for them. Many of the women talked about trying 3, 4, 5 methods, right? Or going back and forth between methods until they found something that worked. And so you see that when men mention they don't like condoms, there can be this pressure on women to then use birth control, or this suggestion, in fact, that if men don't like condoms, it's okay because their partner can just use prescription birth control. But we don't, right? We don't usually see that assumption or that expectation when it comes to women not liking prescription birth control. Instead, the recommendation is that they just keep trying, or that they find a method that is right for them, with the belief being that they'll eventually find one that they can tolerate, even if it's not one that they can quote unquote like. And so there was definitely that gender difference in how we validate people's experiences with dissatisfaction, for sure.
So what are some of the recommendations then? How do we move beyond this sort of gendered, unfair burden between the genders, and move to a space where there is a more equal, it's too bad it's a burden at all, right? But there's an equal sort of taking responsibility for this.
It absolutely has to start with sex education in our families, in our schools, in our communities. The biggest thing is that we have to make sure we're encouraging partners to share responsibility for preventing pregnancy, and really working to interrupt this idea that it should solely be on the woman's plate to make sure that she's taking care of preventing pregnancy for the couple. It requires that all people learn about all methods of birth control, right? In order to have people use the methods, if that's what they choose to do, right? In order to have them use methods that work for them and to be able to try methods, right? We have to make sure that they know about all methods of birth control that are out there, instead of assuming that one method is right for one group of people and one method is right for the other. And it especially requires that we teach people what contraceptive coercion looks like. So in Just Get on the Pill, women often didn't recognize that their partners pressuring them not to use condoms is actually a form of coercion. That's coercion, and they didn't necessarily understand that. And so I think their partners weren't always trying to be coercive. I think they just imagined that if the woman was using prescription birth control, they shouldn't have to use condoms, and they might try and convince them to just forgo using condoms during sex. But that stems at least in part from how we approach sex education in schools and in our families. And so if we want to really improve sex education, we have to shift our framework towards shared responsibility, and recognize that placing pressure only on women to do all the work not only undermines their contraceptive freedom, but it also can risk their health and really facilitate coercion.
So moms of boys should especially take note. I say moms, all parents, of course, but it's mostly moms who listen. So, moms of boys, I think about this as a mom of boys. How do I make sure that I'm raising feminist boys? How do I make sure that they are learning about taking equal responsibility for all sorts of things? So this is certainly an opportunity for those sorts of conversations.
Absolutely. And I also think a big opportunity is for moms trying to raise feminist daughters. It's also to see condom use and buying condoms and using condoms as something that's also about feminism, and also about making sure that people feel empowered over their bodies. So I'm right there with you about trying to think about what this means for raising feminist children, for sure.
Speaking of feminism, I noticed that you talk in the book about, I think, what you call the Black feminist viewpoint, and you talk too about sort of your own personal experiences and knowing, sort of what background you're bringing to your own research. Could you talk just a little bit about that and what that looks like in research?
Absolutely. The biggest thing is making sure that we value everybody's experience in the research process. And so coming into the research, rather than thinking about this from a strictly public health approach that might be thinking about whether or not people are using contraception and its importance for preventing pregnancy and preventing STIs, I really try to understand if they're not using birth control, what's going on for them that makes birth control use that makes it where birth control use is not the ideal circumstance or the ideal situation for them. And that really required decentering the knowledge emphasis, right? So rather than just thinking about what the research says, I had to say, what are these women telling us about their experiences, and what can we as researchers learn from them, instead of assuming that we have the answers, instead of assuming that we are the origin of knowledge and we're just kind of taking their experiences to help other people understand it. It's saying they are teaching me about their experience, and their generosity in sharing their knowledge about their experiences and their what we call embodied expertise, right? Like what it means to live in their bodies and be in their bodies and navigate the world in their bodies. That expertise is actually really important for us as researchers. So a kind of Black feminist way of knowing means that we say, hey, our participants of all backgrounds, of all classes, of all different social groupings, they have something to teach us as researchers. We just have to make sure that we're listening. And that's really the lens that I applied in this research that helped me come to the conclusions that we talked about, with Black women being less likely to just get on the pill, as the name of the book says, right? They were less likely to just get on the pill, which meant that they were more likely not to use any form of birth control, that they could end up not using any form of birth control whatsoever. But I show that that's about understanding their experience and seeing how they try to resist those social pressures that would coerce them into using a particular form of birth control. And it wasn't because of what some people think about folks just not using birth control if they're not thinking about it, right? We have all of these kind of myths about what's going on for people. Using a Black feminist framework helped me see this is what's actually happening with their experiences. And we can learn a lot if we just listen.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. So how can people get a copy of this book?
Absolutely. It's going on. You can pre-order the book now from the major retailers. Go to justgetonthepill.com and there you can go ahead and find the link there to do so.
Excellent. Well, Crystal, thank you so much for speaking with me. This was a really great read. I enjoyed it. I love social sciences anyway, but and I'm so glad that you were happy to talk about not just your research, but why you made the types of choices in research that you did. I find that really compelling. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. It was so much fun.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at twobroadstalk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.